Hello and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I am your host, Bo Heckman. Today is day 2 of the epic tale of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Most of you, I believe, have probably already seen the ballet, which reading this story is drawing up memories of childhood, seeing this on snowy nights and just watching this on, I believe it would be PBS. So this is very warm and cozy for me. As bizarre as the tale is, it is kind of warm and cozy. And we're going to pick up with chapter 6 today, the story of the hard nut. If you have not, if you're just joining us, please look at YouTube, and the first day will be listed there if you are curious about it. A lot has happened. The girl has not gone to bed. She fell into a dream and saw a war between toys and mice and many strange things. So let us just pick up here with chapter 6, the story of the hard nut. Pirlipat's mother was the wife of a king, that is, a queen, and Pirlipat herself was born a princess from the moment of her birth. The king went wild for joy over his lovely little daughter as she lay in the cradle. In his exultation, he danced and whirled about on one leg and cried out over and over again, "Hurrah! Has anybody ever seen anything more beautiful than my Pirlipatkin?" Then all the ministers, generals, and presidents of departments and staff officers hopped about on one leg, like their sovereign, crying with all their might, "No! Never!" But indeed it was not to be denied that in all the world there could be no more beautiful child than Princess Pirlipat. Her little face seemed to be woven out of delicate lily-white and rose-red silk. Her eyes were brightly sparkling blue, and it was pretty to see how her hair curled like shining threads of gold. Besides, Pirlipatkin had brought into the world 2 small rows of pearly teeth, with which, an hour or 2 after her birth, she bit the High Chancellor's finger as he bent down to examine her features closely, so that he shrieked out loudly, "Oh, Gemini!" Others maintained that he cried out, "Oh, Crickety!" And opinions are strongly divided on the point to this day. But the fact is, Pirlipatkin actually bit the High Chancellor's finger, and the enraptured nation now recognized that wit, spirit, and intelligence all at once dwelt in her little angelic body. In short, everybody was delighted. Only the queen showed herself anxious and ill at ease. Nobody knew why. It seemed strange that she had Pirlipat's cradle watched so carefully. Not only were the doors guarded by men-at-arms, but without counting the 2 nurses beside the cradle, 6 others had to sit round about in the room night after night. Then, what appeared quite ridiculous, and what no one could understand, each of these 6 nurses must sit with a cat on her lap, and stroke it so as to keep it purring all night. You could never guess, dear children, why Pirlipat's mother took all these precautions. But I know, and I will tell you now. It happened that once a number of illustrious kings and highly distinguished princes had assembled at the court of Pirlipat's father, on whose account there were grand doings, and many tournaments, plays, and court balls. The king, in order to prove beyond a doubt that he had no lack of gold and silver, was minded for once in a way to dip deeply into the crown treasures and bring out something worthy of the occasion. To this end, being privately informed by the chief cook that the court astronomer had announced propitious day for pork butchering, he ordered a great making of meat puddings and sausages, then jumped into a carriage that he might personally invite the collected kings and princes, only to a plate of soup, and as he put it, the better to enjoy their surprise over the costly banquet. Next, he addressed the Lady Queen in his most winning tones. "It is well known to you, my dear, how fond I am of sausage meat." The Queen knew very well what he would be at. It was just this, that she herself, as she had often done before, should undertake the serious cookery business with her own royal hands. The High Treasurer must at once send the great golden sausage pot and the silver stewpans to the kitchen. A huge fire of sandalwood was kindled there. The Queen tied on her damask cooking apron, and soon all the pots and pans steamed with the sweet odors of pudding making. Right up to the council chamber stole this tempting smell, till the king, seized by a hearty delight, could not restrain himself. "Excuse me, my lords," he claimed, flew quickly down to the kitchen, kissed the Queen, did a little stirring in the pot with his gold scepter, and then went back well pleased to the council. Now it came to that important point when the bacon should be cut into little bits and broiled upon a silver gridiron. The court ladies stood aside, since the Queen, out of loyalty and respect for her royal husband, would fain perform this task alone. But as soon as the bacon began to sputter, a tiny wee whispering voice made itself heard. "Give me, too, some of your fry, my sister. Want to taste? I, a queen like yourself. Give me some of the fry." The Queen knew well that it was Lady Mousykins who spoke thus. Lady Mousykins had lived for many years in the king's palace. She declared herself related to the royal family, and that she was queen in the realm of Mousedom, wherefore she also kept a great count under the hearthstone. Now our Queen was a kind, good-natured lady, and while she would not exactly recognize Lady Mousykins as a queen and her sister, she had not the heart to grudge her a taste of the nice things on feast days, and called out, "Come along, Lady Mousykins. You may always taste my bacon." Thereupon, out popped Lady Mousykins, very smartly, jumped onto the hearth, and with her pretty little paws snapped up one shred of bacon after another, which the Queen held out to her. But next came leaping forth all the uncles and cousins of Lady Mousykins, and into the bargain her 7 sons, right mischievous scamps, who threw themselves on the bacon, not to be kept off for all the frightened Queen could do. Luckily, the chief lady-in-waiting arrived to the rescue, and hunted away these troublesome guests, so that some of the bacon was still saved from their clutches, which had to be sufficiently divided among the sausages after directions of the court mathematician called in for the purpose. Trumpets and kettle drums resounded as the invited potentates and princes came in gorgeous robes of state to the sausage feast, some on while ambling palfreys and some in crystal coaches. The king welcomed them with hearty friendliness and courtesy, then took his place, bearing the royal crown and scepter at the head of the table. When the white puddings were first served, it could be seen how his majesty grew always paler, how he raised his eyes, his bosom heaved with sighs. Violent pangs were evidently raging within him. But when they reached the course of black puddings, he sank back in his armchair, sobbing and moaning. He covered his face with his hands. He broke forth into loud lamentations. All present sprang to their feet. The body physician in vain made an effort to feel the king's pulse. He seemed convulsed by some deep nameless anguish. At length, after many suggestions, after the use of strong remedies, burning of feathers under his nose, and such like, his Majesty, being so far brought to himself, stammered out almost inaudibly these words, "Too little bacon!" "Oh, my poor, unhappy royal spouse," sobbed the disconsolate queen, throwing herself at his feet. "Ah, what pain you must be suffering! But here you see the guilty one before you. Punish her severely." Ah, Lady Mousekins it was, with her 7 sons, her uncles and cousins, who have eaten up the bacon, and thereupon the poor queen fell back in a swoon. "Chief lady-in-waiting, how was this?" cried the king, rising up full of wrath. The chief lady-in-waiting related what had happened as well as she could, and the king vowed to take revenge upon Lady Mousekins and her family, who had eaten up the bacon out of his sausages. The Privy Council being summoned, it was resolved to prosecute Lady Mousekins and to confiscate her property. But as the king considered he might meanwhile go on eating his bacon, the matter was at once played in the hands of the court clockmaker and engineer. This man, who was named exactly like myself, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, undertook by means of a singular piece of statecraft to banish Lady Mousekins and her family forever from the royal palace. He contrived, accordingly, certain small artfully constructed machines in which shreds of toasted bacon were fastened upon a thread, and these Drosselmeyer placed round about the habitation of the bacon nibblers. Lady Mousekins was much too clever not to see through his cunning, but all her warnings, all her lectures were thrown away on her 7 sons, and many, many of her uncles and cousins, who, enticed by the sweet smell of the bait, ventured within Drosselmeyer's machines. Then, as soon as they tried to gnaw away the bacon, found themselves trapped by grating that fell suddenly behind them, and delivered to shameful execution in the very kitchen where they had enjoyed such pleasant feasts. With her small band of surviving subjects, Lady Mousekins abandoned the scene of horror. Woe, despair, and revenge filled her breast. The courtiers exulted, but the queen was troubled, knowing the nature of Mousekins, and too well aware that she would not leave her sons and kinsmen unavenged. Indeed, as her Majesty was one day cooking a fricassee of lights, lungs of pork or beef, a dish much loved by her kingly husband, Lady Mousekins appeared and said, "My sons, my cousins, and kinsmen are dead. Take good heed that the Mouse Queen bite not thy little princes in two. Take good heed! Ha ha!" With this, she went off, and was no more seen. But the queen stood so terrified that she let the fricassee fall into the fire, and for the 2nd time Lady Mousekins had spoiled one of the king's favorite dishes, whereat he was very angry. But now, that is enough for the evening. The rest, another time. Earnestly as Mary, who had her own ideas about this story, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer to go on with it. He would not let himself be persuaded, but jumped up, saying, "Too much at once is not good. More tomorrow." Then, as he was just going out the door, Fred asked, "But do tell us, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it really true that you invented mouse traps?" "How can you talk of such nonsense?" cried his mother. But the counselor laughed in his queer way. "Am I not a clever clockmaker? And must not mouse-traps have been invented somehow or another?" Chapter 8. The Story of the Hard Nut, continued. "Now you see, children," so the counselor continued next evening, "why the queen had the wonderfully beautiful little princess Pirlipat watched over with such care. Was she not right to fear that Lady Mousekins would fulfill her threat by coming back to bite the royal baby in two? Drosselmeyer's machines were of no use at all against the cautious and crafty Mouse Queen, and only the court astronomer, who was also privy interpreter of omens and stars, could divine that the family of Pussy Purr had the power of keeping off mice from the cradle. So it came about that one of the sons of this family, attached to the court with the title of chamber counselors, was held on her lap by each nurse, whose duty was to tickle him into contented performance of such laborious public service. It was the midnight hour, as one of the nurses in chief, who sat close to the cradle, started up from a deep sleep. All around lay buried a slumber. There was no murmur, a silence as of death, in which could be heard the faint click of a faint watch, of a death watch storm. But what were the feelings of the chief nurse when, right before her, she made out a great ugly mouse standing on its hind paws and laying its murderous head on the face of the princess? With a cry of horror, she sprang to her feet. Every one awoke, but in an instant Lady Mousekins, the huge mouse on Pirlipat's cradle, could be no other, scampered off to a corner of the room. The four-footed chamber counselors rushed after her, too late. She had vanished through a crack in the floor. Then, at the noise, Pirlipat awoke, weeping piteously. "Thank heaven," cried the nurse, "she is still alive." How great was their dismay, however, when they looked at Pirlipatkin and saw what had come to the sweet, tender child. Instead, the angelic white and rosy curly-haired pate, a thick, distorted head stood on a small, shrunken, crooked body. The sky-blue eyes had changed into green goggling balls staring straight before them, and the pretty little mouth gaped from ear to ear. The queen was ready to die for weeping and lamentation, and the king's study had to be hung with wadded tapestry, since again and again he ran his head against the wall, exclaiming in most lamentable tones, "Oh, unlucky monarch!" Now might he have seen that it were better to eat his sausages without bacon, and to leave Lady Mousekins and her kindred in peace beneath the hearthstone. But Pirlipat's royal father had no such thought. Rather, he threw all the blame on the court clockmaker and engineer, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg. Therefore, he sagely gave command as follows. Within 4 weeks must Drosselmeyer restore the princess to her former state, or at least suggest some trustworthy means of doing so, else should he suffer a shameful death under the executioner's axe. Drosselmeyer was not a little alarmed, and soon he took courage to trust his art and his good luck, and at once set about the first operation which seemed to him likely to be of use. He very skillfully took Pirlipat to pieces, screwed off her hands and arms, and examined her construction inside. But thus he had the vexation of discovering that the bigger the princess grew, the more unshapely she would become, and she could hit on no way of mending the matter. He carefully put the princess together again, and sank down in gloomy dejection beside her cradle, which he durst not leave day or night. The 4th week had come. It was already Wednesday, when the king looked in with angry eyes, and, shaking his scepter at him, cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, set the princess to rights, or thou must die." Drosselmeyer began to weep bitterly, but the little Princess Pirlipat went on contentedly cracking nuts. For the first time the clockmaker was struck by Pirlipat's unusual appetite for nuts, and by the circumstance that she had come with teeth into the world. Indeed, after her transformation, she had gone on screaming just till she happened to have a nut given to her, which she at once cracked, ate the kernel, and then became quiet. Since then, the nurses could never be done bringing nuts for her. O sacred instinct of nature, eternal mysterious sympathy of all existence, exclaimed Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. Thou showest me the gate of the secret. I will knock, and it will open. He forthwith sought permission to consult the court astronomer, and was taken to him under a strong guard. The two officers embraced each other with many tears, being devoted friends, then retired into a private cabinet to turn over many books which treated of instinct, of sympathy and antipathy, and of other mysteries. Night coming on, the royal astronomer consulted the stars, and, with the help of Drosselmeyer, also well versed in the same art, drew out Princess Pirlipat's horoscope. This proved a hard task, for the lines of fate became more and more entangled as they went on. But at last, oh joy, it lay clear before them that to destroy the enchantment which had so hideously deformed her, and to be made as beautiful as ever, the Princess Pirlipat had nothing to do but eat the sweet kernel of the nut Crackatuck. The nut Crackatuck had such a hard shell that a 48-pound cannon could be driven over it without breaking it. This hard nut must be cracked by the teeth of a man who had never shaved and never worn boots, and he must hand it to the princess with his eyes shut, and not open them until he had taken several steps backward without stumbling. 3 days and 3 nights did Drosselmeyer and the astronomer work unceasingly, and it was only on Saturday, at the king's dinner time, that Drosselmeyer, who was to be beheaded on Sunday, burst in, full of triumphant joy, to announce the discovery of the means for restoring the princess's lost beauty. The king, embracing him with warm affection, promised him a sword set in diamonds, 4 orders of chivalry, and 2 new Sunday coats. Immediately after dinner, set about the business, he bade. See to it, dear engineer, that the young unshaved man in shoes is provided along with the nut Crackatuck, and let him drink no wine beforehand, for fear of his stumbling when he takes 7 steps backward like a crab. After that he can soak himself to his heart's content. Drosselmeyer was sadly taken aback by the king's speech, and, not without consternation and trembling, he stammered forth that the means of cure indeed were discovered, but that the nut and the young man to bite it were still to seek. Indeed, there was some doubt whether Nut and Nutcracker would ever be found. Then you must be beheaded after all, roared the king in a lion voice, wrathfully brandishing the scepter above his crowned head. Luckily, it was for poor Drosselmeyer that the king had enjoyed his dinner that day, so as to be in good humor for listening to the arguments which the magnanimous queen did not fail to bring forward in favor of one whose sad fate had touched her heart. Drosselmeyer plucked up courage and represented on his own part that he had dully fulfilled the task set him, and had earned his pardon by pointing out how the princess could be cured. The king said this was all stuff and nonsense, but finally decided, after he had taken a glass of stomach cordial, that both the clockmaker and the astronomer should set forth, not to return without the nut Crackatuck in their pockets. The man to bite it open, as the queen suggested, must be sought for through repented insertions of an advertisement in the home and foreign newspapers. Here the counselor again broke off, promising to relate the rest next evening. And Chapter 9, The Story of the Hard Nut, concluded. Next evening, as soon as the candles were lighted, Godfather Drosselmeyer made his appearance and went on with his story as follows. 15 years were Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer on their travels without coming on a trace of the Nutcracker, where they wandered far and wide. What strange, wonderful things they fell in with. All this I could go on telling you for a month, but will do nothing of the kind. Enough to say that the sore-troubled Drosselmeyer was at length seized by a mighty longing for his native place, Nuremberg. With extraordinary violence, this longing one day overpowered him. As he sat in great wood in Asia, smoking a pipe of tobacco with his friend. "Oh, my beautiful mother city, who never has seen thee is much to pity, though he travel to London, to Rome, to Burney. After thee his heart must always yearn. After thee, O Nuremberg, town so dear, that hath beautiful houses and windows so clear." As Drosselmeyer lifted up his voice so dolefully, the astronomer was moved by deep sympathy and began to give forth such lamentable howls that they could be heard over a great part of Asia. Then, composing himself, he wiped the tears from his eye and asked, "But, my worthy colleague, why do we sit here and cry? Why do we not go to Nuremberg, since it is all one where and how we search for that fated Nutcracker?" "That's true enough," answered Drosselmeyer, taking comfort. Both at once stood up, knocked the ashes out of their pipes, and went off in a straight line without stopping, for the wood in the middle of Asia to the city of Nuremberg. Scarcely had they arrived there than Drosselmeyer hastened to his cousin, the doll-maker, varnisher, and gilder, Christopher Zacharias Drosselmeyer, whom he had not seen for many, many years. "Ah, cousin, what a wonderful story!" Drosselmeyer went on to tell the adventures of his long travel, how he spent 2 years with the Date King, how he was contemptuously turned away by the Prince of Almonds, how he made inquiries in vain of the Natural History Society in Squirrelstown. In short, how everywhere he had failed to get even a hint of the Nutcracker. During this narration, Christopher Zacharias had kept snapping his fingers, turning about on one foot, clicking with his tongue, then exclaiming, ha, oh, the deuce. Finally, he threw his cap and wig up into the air, warmly embraced his kinsman, and cried out, Cousin, you are saved! Saved you are, I say, for I am much mistaken if I myself do not possess the Nutcracker." At the same time, he pulled out a box from which he drew forth a gilded nut of middling bigness. "See," he said, showing the nut to his cousin. "This is the state of the case. Years ago, a foreigner came to me at Christmas time with a sack full of nuts which he wanted to sell. Right before my shop, he got into a quarrel and laid down the sack that he might better defend himself against the nut sellers of the town, who would not allow a stranger to sell nuts here, and attacked him on this account. At that moment, a heavily loaded wagon rolled over the sack, and all the nuts were broken except one, which the foreigner, with a queer smile, offered me in exchange for a silver groat of the year 1720. It struck me as singular that I found in my pocket just such a coin as the man wanted. So I bought the nut and gilded it, hardly knowing myself why I paid so dear for the thing and treated it of such value." All doubt of the cousin's nut being that long-sought-after one became at once removed, when astronomer, summoned into council, cleverly scraped away the gilding, and on the rind of the nut found engraved in Chinese characters the word Krakatuk. Great was the joy of the travelers, and the cousin the happiest man under the sun, when Drosselmeyer assured him of his fortune being made. For, besides a good pension, he should henceforth receive gratis and all the gold leaf he needed for his gilding. Both the clockmaker and the astronomer had already put on their nightcaps and were going to bed, when the latter, that is, the astronomer, thus began. "My beloved colleague, One piece of luck comes not alone. Believe me, we have found not only the Nutcracker, but also the young man who can crack it and restore the princess to her beauty. I mean no one else than the son of your worthy cousin. Nay, I will not sleep, he continued enthusiastically, but this very night will cast the youth's horoscope. Therewith he tore off his nightcap and at once set about taking observations. The cousin's son was indeed a nice, well-grown young man who had never yet shaved or worn boots. In his earlier youth, he had acted as a jumping jack for several Christmases, but that was not in the least perceptible, as his father had taken so much pains to educate him and set him straight. At Christmas time, he wore a fine red coat laced with gold, a sword, a hat under his arm, and a first-class head of hair gathered into a bag behind. So splendidly adorned, he stood in his father's shop, and out of natural politeness cracked nuts for the young ladies, on which account they called him the handsome little Nutcracker. "It is he!" cried the astronomer, next morning falling rapturously on the clockmaker's neck. "We have him! He is found!" But two things, dearest colleague, must be seen to. In the first place, you must provide your excellent kinsman with a strong wooden head, having an underjaw that will stand a good strain. Then, on arriving at the capital, we ought to keep it carefully secret that we have brought along with us the young man to bite open the Nutcracker. He should come on the scene some time later. I read in the horoscope that the king, after some others have broken their teeth over it to no purpose, will promise the hand of the princess and succession to the kingdom as rewarded for whoever can crack this nut and restore Pirlipat's lost beauty. Drosselmeyer's cousin, the doll-maker, was well content that his youngster should marry the Princess Pirlipat and become a prince and king, and he left the whole change of the business to the messengers. The head, which Drosselmeyer fitted on to his hopeful young nephew, turned out very well, so that he made most successful experiments at cracking the hardest peach stones. As soon as Drosselmeyer and the astronomer announced at the palace their arrival with the Nutcracker, the necessary advertisements were at once published, and these travelers being now supplied with the beauty charm, many fine young men, some of them princes, eagerly came forward, trusting in their sound jaws to undertake Pirlipat's disenchantment. The messengers were not a little horrified when they saw the princess again. Her small body, with its shrunken members, could scarcely support the huge unshapely head, while the hideousness of her countenance was enhanced by a white woolly beard that had grown over her mouth and chin. All happened just as the court astronomer had read in the horoscope. One youngster in shoes after another bit away at the Nutcracker till he broke his teeth and jaws, without doing the princess the least good. And as each was then borne away, half fainting, by the dentist kept ready at hand, he would moan out, "That was a hard nut!" When now the king, in the anguish of his heart, promised daughter and kingdom to whoever would perform the disenchantment, there presented himself that pretty lad from Nuremberg, and modestly begged permission to make a trial. None of the candidates had pleased the princess so much as young Drosselmeyer. She laid her little hand on her heart and sighed deeply. Ah, if it were he who should bite open the Nutcracker and become my husband. After most civilly saluting the king and queen, and also the Princess Pirlipat, young Drosselmeyer took the Nutcracker from the chief master of ceremonies, put it between his teeth, worked his head powerfully, and crack, crack, the shell broke up into several bits. Dexterously picking from the kernel the rough fibers about it, he handed it to the princess with a respectful scrape of his foot, then closed his eyes and began to step backward. The princess at once swallowed the nut. Oh, wonder! The deformity was gone, and there in its place stood an angelic figure, the face dimpled rosy red and lily white, the eyes of shining blue, the long locks curled like threads of gold. Music of trumpets and kettle drums swelled the loud exultation of the people. The king and his whole court danced on one leg at Pirlipat's birth, and the queen had to be treated with eau de cologne, having fainted away in her transports of joy. Young Drosselmeyer, who had still the 7 steps backwards to accomplish, was not a little flustered by this great tumult. Yet he kept his balance, and stood raising his right foot for the last step, when Lady Mousikins, squeaking and squealing shrilly, ran out of the floor, so that in the act of setting down his foot he trampled upon her, which made him stumble, and he had almost fallen. Oh, mishap! Suddenly was the youth become as deformed an object as Princess Pirlipat before. His body had shrunk up, and could scarcely bear the weight of the big unshapely head with great eyes staring out of it, and broad, horribly gaping mouth. Instead of his fine bunch of hair, there hung behind him a kind of narrow wooden cloak, with which his lower jaw was worked. Clockmaker and astronomer stood beside themselves for dread and amazement, yet they saw how Lady Mousikins rolled all bleeding on the floor. Her ill nature had not gone unpunished, for with the sharp heel of his shoe, young Drosselmeyer had trodden so hard on her neck that she must die. And, writhing in her death agony, she squeaked and squawked pitiably, "O Crackatuck, hard nut that proves my end! Ah, Nutcracker, thy hour is now at hand! Hee hee! Woe's me, but also woe to thee! My son, the Mouse King with the 7 crowns, will soon avenge his murdered mother's wrongs on thee, thou ugly, spoiled, conceited doll! O life so fair and bright, from which I fall to shades of gloomy death! I fail for breath, my last I speak. Oh, ah, eh!" Squeak. With this cry expired Lady Mousikins, and was carried out by the royal firemender. Hitherto no one had thought of young Drosselmeyer, but now Pirlipat reminded the king of his promise, and at once he ordered the hero of the day to be brought forward. But when the unfortunate fellow showed himself in all his deformity, the princess held both hands before her eyes, crying, "Away, away with this hideous Nutcracker!" Forthwith, the high marshal seized him by his narrow shoulders and threw him out the door. The king, full of rage that a Nutcracker should be forced upon him as a son-in-law, put all the blame on the clockmaker and the astronomer and banished them forever from his capital. That had not appeared in the horoscope which the astronomer cast at Nuremberg. But he did not fail to make fresh observations, and now read in the stars that young Drosselmeyer might take part in his new condition, for, in spite of his deformity, he should yet become a prince and a king. His unshapeliness, however, could disappear only when the 7-headed heir of Lady Mousikins, whom she had borne after the death of her 7 elder sons, should have been slayed by his hand, and when a lady had fallen in love with him, deformed as he was. You must have actually seen young Drosselmeyer about Christmas time in his father's shop at Nuremberg, a Nutcracker, it is true, but also a prince in disguise. Therefore, children, it is the story of the hard nut, and how you know why people so often say, "That was a hard nut to crack," and how it comes that nutcrackers are so ugly. So ended the counselor's tale. Mary thought that Princess Pirlipat was an ill-natured, ungrateful thing, But Fred assured her that if Nutcracker were a brave fellow, he would easily do for the Mouse King, and soon regain his former lovely appearance. Chapter 10. Uncle and the Nephew. If it ever happened to any of my honored hearers or readers to get cut by glass, he will know for himself how much it hurts, and what a bad thing it is altogether, since it takes so long to heal. Mary had to spend nearly a whole week in bed, and when she got up she felt quite light-headed. But at last she grew well again, and could run about the room as merrily as ever. The glass cupboard made a fine show, for there stood all new and clean, the trees and flowers and toy houses, and the beautiful splendid dolls. First of all, Mary looked for her dear Nutcracker, who, from his place on the second shelf, smiled back to her with his teeth quite in good order. As she again so affectionately surveyed her favorite, it suddenly came into her troubled heart that all Godfather Drosselmeyer's tale was nothing but the history of this Nutcracker and his feud with Lady Mousekins and her son. Now she saw that her Nutcracker could be no other than young Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg, the Godfather's handsome nephew, so unhappily transformed by Lady Mousekins. For that the skillful clockmaker of the court of Pirlipat's father was nobody but Councillor Drosselmeyer himself. Mary had never doubted for a moment, even while listening to the tale. "But why did your uncle not help you? Why did he not help you?" lamented Mary, as she always more and more vividly conceived the idea that in that battle of which she had been a witness, Nutcracker's kingdom and crown were at stake. Were not all the other toys his subjects? Was it not sure that the court's astronomer's prophecy would be fulfilled, and the young Drosselmeyer become king of Toyland? Wise Mary went on turning the matter over in her mind till she believed that Nutcracker and his vassals had actually the life and motion which she attributed to them in her imagination. It was not so. Everything in the cupboard remained stiffer and stiller than ever, and Mary, resolutely clinging to her inner conviction, put the blame of this on the continued enchantment worked by Lady Mousekins and her seven-headed son. Yet she said out loud to the Nutcracker, "If you are not in a condition to move yourself or speak to me the least little word, I know, dear Herr Drosselmeyer, that you can understand me and my good will to see you. So you may count on my assistance in the hour of need. At all events, I will ask your uncle to give you the aid of his skill where it is necessary." Nutcracker remained quiet and still, but to Mary it seemed that a light sigh breathed through the cupboard door, the glass panes thrilling forth almost inaudibly, but in wondrously sweet tones, as if a small bell note were singing. "Mary mine, protectress dear, it will be thine, O Mary dear." In the ice-cold shudder which came over her, Mary yet felt a strange joy. Twilight now drew on. Her father entered the room with Grandfather Drosselmeyer. Then it was not long before Louisa set out the tea-table, and the family sat around it, taking pleasantly about all sorts of things. Mary had quietly brought her small armchair and placed herself at the godfather's feet. When the others for a moment were silent, she looked with her great blue eyes right into the councillor's face and said, "I know now, dear godfather, that my Nutcracker is your nephew, the young Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg. He has become a prince, or rather a king. So much has come true, as your companion, the astronomer, prophesied. But you know well that he is at open war with Lady Mousekins' son, the ugly Mouse King. Why don't you give him help?" Mary further related the whole course of the battle as she had witnessed it, and was often interrupted by her mother and Louisa laughing at her. Only Fred and the councillor kept their gravity. "Wherever did the girl get all that silly stuff into her head?" said the doctor. "Oh, she has a lively imagination," answered her mother. "There are just dreams which came from the feverishness of her heart." "It is not at all true," said Fred. "My hussars are not such cowards." But Godfather Drosselmeyer, smiling queerly, took the little girl on his lap and spoke more softly than ever. "Ah, my dear Mary, to you belongs a gift denied to me and to us all. You are a born princess like Pirlipit, for you reign in a beautiful, bright kingdom. But you have much to suffer if you make the cause of poor deformed Nutcracker your own. For the Mouse King persecutes him in all ways. Yet you, not I, you alone can save him, if you will only be loyal and steadfast." Neither Mary nor anyone else knew what Drosselmeyer meant by these words. Indeed, they seemed to the doctor so odd that he felt the counselor's pulse and said, "My good friend, you have your head all wrong. I will prescribe something for you." But the doctor's wife shook her head thoughtfully and said half to herself, "I can guess what the counselor means, though I can't put it into your plain words." Chapter 11. The Victory. Not long afterwards, Mary was awakened one moonlight night by a strange tumult that seemed to come from one corner of the room. It was as if pebbles were being thrown and rolled about, amid a hideous accompaniment of hissing and squeaking. "Ah, the mice are coming back!" cried Mary in terror, and would have waked her mother, but she could not utter a word, or even move a finger, as she saw the Mouse King working himself through the hole in the wall, till at length, with sparkling eyes and shining crowns, he advanced into the room, then, with a mighty bound, sprang up on a small table which stood close to Mary's bed. "He! Must give me your sugar plums, your toffee, small thing, else I bite that Nutcracker of yours into pieces. Nutcracker, do you hear?" So piped out the Mouse King, gnashing and clashing horribly with his teeth, and quickly sprang out of sight again through the mouse hole. Mary was quite pale, and could scarcely speak for inward agitation. 100 times she thought of telling what had happened to her mother, or to Louisa, or at least to Fred. But she asked herself, "Will any of them believe me? And shall I not be well laughed at by everybody?" Yet it was quite clear to her that she must sacrifice her sugar plums and toffee to save Nutcracker. As much as she had of these nice things, she laid out that evening on the edge of the cupboard itself. Next morning her mother said, "I don't know how the mice have got into our parlor. Just see, poor Mary, they have eaten up all your sweet stuff." Indeed, it was so. The sticky toffee had not proved much to the taste of the greedy Mouse King, but he had nibbled all over it with sharp teeth, so that it must be thrown away. Mary did not take the loss of her sweets much to heart. Rather, she secretly rejoiced to think that it had saved Nutcracker's life. But what were her feelings when next night there came again a squeaking and a squalling at her ear? Ah, it was the Mouse King back again, and still more horribly glowed his eyes than the night before, and still more hatefully hissed he between his teeth. "Must give me your sugar and gingerbread figures, little thing, or I bite your Nutcracker in pieces." And with this, away scampered the grim Mouse King. In great distress, Mary went next morning to the cupboard, and sorrowfully looked at her sugar and gingerbread men. She had reason indeed to be sorrowful, for you can't think, my good reader, that dear little figures made out of sugar and gingerbread Mary Stahlbaum possessed. First of all, a very pretty shepherd with a shepherdess was feeding a whole herd of milky white sheep, and his dog jumped close, quite like life, and came 2 postmen with letters in their hands, and 4 fine couples of nicely dressed young men, with maidens elegantly adorned all over, were rocking themselves in a swing boat. Behind some ballet dancers stood old King Cole, beside the Maid of Orleans, for whom Mary did not care so very much. But right back in the corner was a red-cheeked little child, her favorite of all. The tears sprang into Mary's eyes. Ah, dear Herr Drosselmeyer, she cried, turning to the Nutcracker, whatever will I not do to save you? But still it is hard. The Nutcracker, the while, looked so sad that Mary, who could fancy she saw the Mouse King's 7 jaws open to devour the unhappy youth, resolved to sacrifice everything for his sake. All her sugar figures she set out this evening on the edge of the shelf, as before she had done with the goodies. She kissed the shepherd, the shepherdess, the little lambs, and last of all she fetched from the corner her favorite, the dear red-cheeked child, whom she took care to put behind all the rest. The gingerbread old King Cole and the Maid of Orleans had to stand in the first row. "Oh, this is too bad," exclaimed her mother next morning. "There must be a great nasty mouse living in the cupboard, for all poor Mary's pretty sugar figures are gnawed and bitten to bits." Mary could hardly keep back her tears, but she soon smiled again at the thought, what does it matter so long as Nutcracker is safe? In the evening, when her mother told the counselor about the mischief of a mouse did in the children's cupboard, Dr. Stahlbaum remarked that a pity it was that they could not get rid of this pest which played at such tricks in the cupboard and ate up Mary's sweet things. "Well," put in Fred eagerly, "the baker, who lives below us, has a fine great chamber counselor, which I can bring up. He will soon stop these doings and bite off the mouse's head, were it Lady Mousikins herself or her son or the Mouse King." "Yes, by jumping about on chairs and tables," laughed his mother, "and upsetting cups and glasses, and doing ever so much more damage." "Not at all," answered Fred. "The baker's cat is a clever fellow. I wish I could walk as steadily along the sharp roof as he can." "Only let us have no puss at night," begged Louisa, who could not bear cats. "Fred is right," said his father. "But first we might try setting a trap. Have we none?" "We can get the best kind from godfather Drosselmeyer, who invented them," cried Fred. All the rest laughed. And the mistress declaring that there was no trap in the house, the counselor said he had several, and sent at once for a first-class one. Their godfather's story of the hard nut came now clearly into mind of Mary and Fred. While Crook was toasting the bacon, Mary trembled with excitement, and her head full of the story and its marvels, thus addressed their familiar Betsy. "Ah, Lady Queen, do beware of Mousikins and her family." But Fred had drawn his sword, bidding the whole race of mice come on, and he would soon clear them off. All, however, remained still under and about the hearthstone, when now the counselor tried the shred of bacon on the thin thread, and softly laid the trap in the cupboard. Fred called out, "Take care, godfather clockmaker, that the Mouse King plays you no trick." And what had poor Mary to go through that night? There came an ice-cold creeping up and down her arm, and a loathsome breath on her cheek, and a piping and squeaking in her ear. The horrible Mouse King sat on her shoulder, blood-red foam dripping out of its 7 open jaws, and gnashing and clashing with his teeth, he hissed out to Mary as she lay motionless for fear and dread. "Hiss, hiss, none of your bacon. Mouse King too sharp not to be taken. Trap very fine, but not what it looks. Give me out now your picture books. Do you hear? And your new frock too, else there shall be no peace for you. You very well know Nutcracker must go. I will tear him so, hee, pee, squeak, squeak." Now was Mary overcome by sorrow and woe. She looked so pale and out of sorts that when her mother next morning remarked that the mouse had not been caught, believing Mary to be afraid of it and distressed about the loss of her sweets, she added, "But never mind, dear child. We will soon get rid of the naughty mouse. If traps are no good, Fred must bring up his gray chamber counselor." As soon as Mary found herself alone in the parlor, she went up to the glass cupboard and, sobbing, spoke thus to her Nutcracker. Ah, my dear good Herr Drosselmeyer, what can a poor unhappy girl do for you? Were I to give all my picture books, even my beautiful new frock, which I got as a Christmas present, to be torn to pieces by the horrible Mouse King, will he not then go on asking more and more, so that at last I shall have nothing left to give, and he will want to bite up me myself instead of you? Oh, poor girl that I am, what can I do now? What am I to do now? Weeping and lamenting so bitterly, little Mary noticed through the night a great spot of blood had been left on Nutcracker's neck. Ever since she knew that her Nutcracker was properly young Drosselmeyer, the counselor's nephew, she had given up carrying him in her arms, and cuddled and kissed him no more. Indeed, out of a certain shyness, she hardly liked to touch him. Yet now she took him very carefully out of the cupboard and began to rub the blood spot from his neck with her pocket handkerchief. But what was her amazement when she all at once felt Nutcracker growing warm in her hands and beginning to move his limbs. Quickly she set him back in the cupboard, where his little mouth waggled shakily up and down, and painfully he lisped out, "Ah, most worthy Miss Stahlbaum, excellent friend, how can I thank you for all? Yes, no picture book, no Christmas frock shall you sacrifice for me. Procure me only a sword, and I will answer for the rest. Let him do his worst." Here Nutcracker's speech died away, and his eyes, lately animated by an expression of inward grief, became again fixed and dull as glass. Mary felt no horror. Rather, she skipped for joy, now knowing the means to save Nutcracker without further sore sacrifices. But wherever was she to get a sword for the small man? She resolved to take Fred into counsel, and that evening, her parents having gone out, as these two sat together in the parlor by the glass cupboard, she told him all that happened to her with Nutcracker and the Mouse King, and what was now required for the former's deliverance. Nothing of all this made such an impression on Fred as how, according to Mary's report, his hussars had behaved themselves so badly in the battle. He just asked very seriously whether things had really gone as she said, and when she assured him on her word that it was so, he went at once to the cupboard, addressed his hussars with a moving speech, then, as a punishment for their selfishness and cowardice, cut the cockades off their hats, one after another, and forbade them to play the hussar guards. March for a year, his reprimand ended, he returned to Mary, saying, "As for the sword, I can supply Nutcracker, for yesterday I pensioned off an old colonel for cuirassiers who does not need this sword any more." The said colonel was enjoying the pension assigned him by Fred in a back corner of the top shelf. Thence being fetched down, his smart silver-mounted sword was taken off him and hung round the waist of Nutcracker. That night Mary could not sleep for anxious dread. At midnight she thought she could hear in the parlor a strange stir, a clang, a confusion. All of a sudden it went squeak. "The Mouse King! The Mouse King!" cried Mary, and sprang, startled, out of bed. All was still, but soon there came a soft tapping at the door, and a tiny voice made itself heard. "Dearest Miss Stahlbaum, now you can be at ease. Good, joyful news." Mary recognized the voice of young Drosselmeyer threw on her dress and hurriedly opened the door. Outside of it stood little Nutcracker, the dripping sword in his right hand, a wax light in his left. As soon as he saw Mary, he knelt down on one knee and spoke thus: "You alone, my lady, are she who steeled my heart with courage, and gave my arm strength to combat the haughty foe that dared insult you. Conquered lies the traitorous Mouse King, and wallows in his blood. Scorn not, O lady, to receive the tokens of victory at the hands of your till death devoted knight. With this, Nutcracker pulled off the 7 golden crowns of the Mouse King, strung round his left arm, and handed them over to Mary, who received them with delight. Then, rising to his feet, he went on. Ah, my dearest Miss Stahlbaum, having now overpowered my enemy, what wonderful things could I not show you if you would only have the kindness to follow me a little way. Please do, oh, please do, dear young lady. And we will stop here today and resume with Chapter 12, The Toy Kingdom, tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in to Storytime Classics Live. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And if you're going outside, please remember, stay safe and wear a mask.